Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marie Campos, and I am the Education and Foundation Director here at ANCOR. I am the meeting chair for today's webinar on Election 2016, Empowering the IDD Community to Rock the Vote. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping reminders for everybody. If you happen to have any technical problems during this webinar, please double check your internet connection and or your computer speakers. Audio is broadcast through your computer speakers. If you do need to contact the ReadyTalk support team, I'll provide their phone number in the chat box for your reference during the webinar. We're also offering real-time captioning for today's webinar, and the link for captioning is in the chat box below for reference as well. And along those lines, we are using the chat box for today's Q&A, so if you have any questions for the presenters, the moderator, or for me, the meeting chair, please just send us a question in the chat box. And finally, I just want to confirm that we are sending out a copy of the slides and the audio recording to everyone who's registered for the webinar, so please keep an eye out from me, Marie Campos, after today's presentation. And now that housekeeping is out of the way, I'll turn this over to Esme Grant-Grewal, who is ANCOR's Senior Director of Government Relations and moderating today's webinar. Esme?
Thank you, Marie, and hello, everyone. Again, this is Esme Grant-Grewal. I'm your Senior Director of Government Relations at ANCOR. And I'm so excited for today's webinar just before this historic general election on November 8th. I just want to underscore the importance that providers play in this voting process. I often say that providers have the distinguished honor of helping to implement the Americans with Disabilities Act and other key disabilities rights, and that they're helping folks access their right to vote is no exception to that. So I think it's really important that we have this discussion today, discuss these resources, and I will get us started by introducing our tremendous speakers. I would say some of the folks that are mostly connected to voting issues for people with disabilities. So we've really brought you the true experts in this field. We have three speakers that will be presenting today. We have Jennifer Laszlo-Mizrahi of RespectAbility. We have Zach Baldwin of the American Association of People with Disabilities. And we have Abe Rossi, who's joining us from the ARC of the United States. So let me go over their bios quickly, and then we'll pass it off for Jennifer to begin, followed by Zach and then Abe. Following that, as Marie mentioned, we will have a Q&A. So please do feel free to add in questions throughout the presentation in that chat box. So Jennifer Laszlo-Mizrahi is the president of RespectAbility, which is a nonprofit organization working to empower people with disabilities to achieve the American dream. She works regularly with disability organizations, national, state, and local policy leaders, workforce development professionals, media, employers, philanthropists, celebrities, and faith-based organizations in order to expand opportunities for people with disabilities. She has led numerous national polls and brought significant visibility to the issues of America's 56 million citizens with disabilities. She's the co-author of a major toolkit on best practices on employment for people with disabilities and frequently hosts webinars on this topic. She has done projects with the White House, more than 60 U.S. senators, and has helped elect prime ministers and presidents around the world. She's an expert in strategic communications, political strategy, and on numerous public policies, including international relations. Ms. Jennifer Laszlo-Mizrahi has extensive experience, having worked with her myself. I know this. So I would really encourage you to visit the RespectAbility website to find out more. But I will say that for those of you who, like me, who enjoy watching Born This Way on A&E, she was really instrumental in making sure that show was able to come to us. So a big thanks to her for that. Zach Baldwin will be following Jennifer's presentation. He serves as the Director of Outreach for AAPD, which stands for the American Association of People with Disabilities. As the Director of Outreach for AAPD, Zach manages communications, programs, and special projects. On the communications end, this entails social media interaction, email engagement, and press inquiries. Current programs that he supervises include the Summer Internship Program for Students with Disabilities, the Rev Up campaign, which we'll talk more about in today's presentation, Disability Mentoring Day, the Innovation Institute, and the Disability Equality Index. you don't know what that is, I highly encourage people to look up the Disability Equality Index. Prior to his current role as Director of Outreach, Zach served as AAPD's Development Associate, and he graduated from American University in Washington, D.C. Abe Rossi will be ending our presentation today. He's the Director of Digital Strategy at the ARC. He's charged with enabling the ARC to achieve the digital dimensions of its goals. He has organized and led product development teams to create online communities, mobile applications, websites, and business intelligence tools for social change. Organizations such as Ashoka, Disability Rights International, and the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. Abe is a longtime advocate for people with disabilities, having investigated human rights abuses in institutions for people with disabilities and trained human rights activists in Serbia, Turkey, and Russia. He is a former Peace Corps volunteer from Russia and a graduate of the University of Michigan. And like me, he's also a sibling of a person with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I know personally knows how valuable the right to vote is for our siblings and folks that have intellectual and developmental disabilities. So with no further ado, let me send it over to Jennifer to kick off our presentation today. Jennifer?
Thank you, Esme, and thank you to ANCOR for hosting this. It's really terrific to be with this outstanding group of people, these terrific speakers, and I really love, as a person with a disability myself and as the parent of children with disability, just think that this is such an important issue. So RespectAbility, as you heard, we're a nonprofit organization, and I want to make very, very clear that we are not partisan. So we are not endorsing or rating these candidates. We are giving you straight information to help you in your efforts. So again, we are a nonpartisan organization. Voting is the right of every American, and it's very important for people with disabilities to be able to achieve those rights, to exercise those rights just like anybody else. And what we see in a poll that was done in 2012 of likely voters is that the majority of voters are either an individual with a disability or they know someone with a disability who is very, very close to them. So I'm just going to give you some stats on that. So 56% of likely voters in 2014 said that they, a family member, or a close friend has a disability. And actually, we're going to be releasing brand new polls from the 2016 election very soon. I just looked at those poll numbers today. They're very similar, so we're looking at a situation where at least half of the voters either have a disability or they have a loved one with a disability. So we're a very important voting group, as it does touch more than half the electorate. And this is just a breakdown because obviously there are more people that are close friends of individuals with disabilities or family members of those with disabilities than there are people with disabilities who are actually voting. But I do think it's important to note that a smaller percentage of people with disabilities are within the voter pool than there are people with disabilities. In other words, people with disabilities are less likely at this point in time to exercise their right to vote than people without disabilities. And we saw that in the recent Rutgers study. So it's very important for helping people with disabilities to get out and vote, because on their own, we're not doing it in the same numbers, the same percentages as our non-disabled peers. Because actually, let me go back to that slide. In this slide, it shows 15% of the electorate, and it's roughly the same in this new poll that's about to come out, are people with disabilities, but in America, we're fully 20% of the country, so we are not voting in as large of the numbers as we should be voting, and that's very, very important. Also important is to understand that there is a great divide partisan-wise amongst people with disabilities, and that there are Democrats, Republicans, and independents who are all individuals with disabilities, or are their family members or friends. We are very, very diverse. I mean, people with disabilities can be any race, any age, any gender or gender identity or sexual orientation, and we really range in terms of the political parties. So it's really not right for people to think that voters with disabilities are in the side of one political party or another. We really span the entire spectrum politically. And we are really, really interested in employment as the top issue. So employment really is very important, and everybody in the intellectual disability community understands this because so few people with disabilities are in the workforce, and that is especially true of people with ID. And so you do see, though, that people with disabilities are very enthusiastic about the election, but you don't see them turning out to vote. So there is this big gap between wanting to vote and actually voting, and so driving people to the polls and getting them to the polls or getting them to fill out absentee ballots is very, very important. This is from 2014, where you can take a look at voters with disabilities compared to those without disabilities. And what you see is that the economy and wages and jobs are even more important for the disability community than they are for those who are not in the disability community, but that the disability community, ironically, has had fewer concerns about the new health care law than the non-disabled community. And I think part of that is because people are very happy in the disability community that at least with a pre-existing condition, you can get health care coverage. It is important to note that we are a very large number of people in America. 35.4 million Americans with disabilities are eligible to vote in this election. 1 out of 6 out of the total electorate. Again, it's 35 million Americans. And also that every single year, 300,000 young people with disabilities age into what should be the workforce. And we see from surveys that 70% of them want to be employed, at least 70% of them, according to the Kessler study. But what we have seen is that obviously they are not employed. So that is a huge issue for youth with disabilities who are exiting our school systems, and that we are the poorest of the poor in America, according to the U.S. Census. So our organization, in a very nonpartisan way, went to the political primaries in Iowa and in New Hampshire. In Iowa is a caucus, in New Hampshire is a primary, and we were able to speak with 100% of the original presidential candidates. And by the way, in the beginning there were 22 of them. We spoke with each of them no fewer than 5 different times, asking them about disability issues. And we really focused, as I said, with all 22 of them, a lot on this issue of employment and empowerment. But we have a whole range of questions, and one of them is just in how to be involved in the campaigns. This is a group of campaign professionals from a broad range of the campaigns. We literally had the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Cruz campaign and the Trump campaign all sitting at the same table, where we were speaking with them about things like how to make your videos have captions and how to make your campaign accessible for people who use wheelchairs or screen readers and that sort of thing. And it was very interesting along the way to see which of the campaigns really took that to heart and made their campaigns completely accessible and which did not. What we saw was that in the beginning with Hillary Clinton, for example, one of the very first things that she did, unfortunately, was to park in a parking lot of that was a handicapped parking space. Her first video at the launch did not have disability in it. But over the course of the 18 months of the campaigns, we've seen a tremendous growth on disability issues, and she has very specific plans on a very wide number of disability issues. And you can see a link that we did a questionnaire. She answered it very, very thoroughly. And so on 17 different questions, you have her answers in a completely nonpartisan way is how we reached out to her. We gave that same set of questionnaires and information to Mr. Trump, and he did not fill out our survey, but he did fill out the AAPD one, as I'm sure you'll hear later, so there's some information that is there. When we did this survey, we decided then to move on and do it with the swing Senate and governor's races. And people with disabilities can really be the deciders in this election in governor's races and Senate races. And the Senate races are so important this cycle as to who is going to control the Senate in the next cycle as very important races. So we had these 16 questions for people running for governor and 17 for people running for Senate, because foreign policy only applies to the Senate. And you can see for all of them what their answers are. Now, if you go to www.therespectabilityreport.org, you can see what their answers are. So I'm just going to show that all of these candidates filled it out in great detail. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm just going to let you know that they are all available here, and there's many more that have since been added, even since I made this PowerPoint here. So you can find many, many ideas and much information. We've done a voter guide for each of the 50 states. I encourage you to go to therespectabilityreport.org and get the voter guide for your state, because it will have all in one place all the candidates from your state that answered the questionnaire. And it also has a link, importantly, to the Rev Up questionnaire, which I would like to congratulate Nicole and AAPD for their work on this Rev Up stuff. But I also want to remind you that not everyone has filled these out, and so it is important to still reach out to the presidential campaign staffers and to the candidates for governor or senate who have not filled out the candidate questionnaires, and to encourage them to do so. So you can see there the links for how you can connect to the candidates from your state, reach out to them, and ask them to fill out the questions so that we know their views on disability issues. Here are some tweets that you can tweet at them, and you can find this all on the PowerPoint that you can get after this call, and I'd be happy to answer questions later. But I'd like to turn it over to the other speakers, and I want to thank ANCOR very much and Esme for hosting me and these others on this very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's move to Zach from AAPD.
Great. Thanks, Esme, and thank you, Jennifer, for giving your presentation. I just want to expand on a couple of the stats that Jennifer gave. She mentioned the roughly 35 million number of people with disabilities that are eligible to vote in this election. When we expand that number to include our families within the same household, the number increases to around 62.7 million eligible voters, which is approximately 1/4 of the total electorate. So when we count the disability community as a whole, our friends, our families, we make up a very large portion of the electorate, and can have a pretty dramatic impact if we're all able to turn out to vote. Unfortunately, as Jennifer mentioned too, that's not always the case. In 2012, approximately 30% of people with disabilities reported some issue accessing the polls, compared to only 8% of people without disabilities. So I think that speaks to the work that Jennifer, Abe, and I, and a lot of other folks in the community are all doing, and we appreciate all of you being on the webinar today to learn more and learn how you can help the people that you support. So the Rev Up campaign stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. Our goals here are to increase the political power of the disability community, and to engage candidates for public office as well as the media on disability issues. So we've been focused a lot on getting people with disabilities registered to vote, engaged in the political process, educated about the candidates and the initiatives that are going on in their communities, while also trying to engage the candidates who are running for office and the media to have disability included as part of the larger national discussion. This year, through our work, we have regular engagement with a little over 350 advocates across 27 states. And these are the folks that I personally engage with frequently over email or over phone calls to share resources, learn what they're doing on the ground in their states, and help try to connect them to other folks who are organizing. Earlier this year, we held National Disability Voter Registration Week from July 11th through the 15th. This was our attempt to have a concerted effort within the disability community to get folks registered and to try to show a larger impact of everybody focusing on voter registration during the same time. We also got 37 proclamations of National Disability Voter Registration Week from various states, cities, and counties all across the country, as well as a joint letter from former Senators Tom Harkin and Bob Dole expressing their support for this initiative. and it's something that we plan to continue in the future. The Rev Up Presidential Candidate Questionnaire, I'll get to that in a little bit more detail a bit later on. This was a comprehensive questionnaire that AAPD and NICL put together, the National Council on Independent Living put together, and sent to all of the presidential candidates who are on more than 20 state ballots and are open to any other presidential candidates to submit their responses. To date, we have received a response from Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The questions that we asked focus on a wide variety of issues, addressing areas such as leadership, employment, civil rights, transportation, technology, education, voting, housing, and healthcare. And I'll review some of those questions in just a bit. We also helped organize around National Voter Registration Day. This is a broader effort that's hosted by the National Association of Secretaries of States and several other partner organizations to have a one-day focused on getting folks registered to vote. It happened at the end of September, so right before a lot of the voter registration deadlines. And because of the success that the Rev Up campaign saw with National Disability Voter Registration Week, we organized our folks to participate in this day as well. Now that many of the voter registration deadlines have passed or will pass very soon, we're trying to focus more on get out the vote activities and working with our partners at the state level to talk to the people in their communities that they engage with every day to help them visualize a plan on how they're going to go vote, make sure they know where their polling places are and when they're going to vote, etc. A couple examples of what's been happening around the country. In Maine, the folks from Disability Rights Maine, which is the state's protection and advocacy agency, they hosted a voter registration event in Portland and in Bangor, where they brought in one of Maine's new accessible voting systems. So folks were able to interact with the machine and get familiar with it so that they would be better prepared on election day when they go in to cast their ballot. The folks in New Jersey, we had a number of different Centers for Independent Living host voter registration events all across the state, and they had organized various giveaways and activities to help engage the community and attract more folks to come in. And I gave those examples to say that if any of the people you support in your community, I encourage you to reach out to your local Center for Independent Living or your local your state protection and advocacy agency to see what they're doing around voting. A lot of the protection and advocacy agencies will have staff on hand that are specifically trained around voting rights and can be a resource to you if you and the people you support run into any problems while they're trying to cast a ballot on election day. And similar, the staff at your local Center for Independent Living will also be very knowledgeable, and they may be organizing events like the folks in Maine that can provide additional education about the election and the voting process. Just quickly to give you a glimpse into where we want to take the Rev Up campaign in the future, it's something that we want to keep established beyond November 8th. So looking at 2017 and beyond, we'll be trying to build state voting coalitions where we have representatives from every state who are committed to this issue and can take the lead on organizing other advocates in their state. And we would coordinate all of these representatives at the national level so that they could interact with other representatives from other states to share successes or share challenges, share resources, so that we can work collectively to better support the political engagement of people with disabilities. We're also looking at potentially targeting a specific election in 2017 where we can measure the current impact of the disability community, go in and be very hands-on with a lot of voter registration, education, and outreach, and then be able to measure our impact after the election to demonstrate that when we come together as a community and focus our efforts, that we can have an impact there. So now I want to move into reviewing a few resources and rights for you all to take back to the folks that you support. A voter with a disability has the right to vote privately and independently, to have an accessible polling place, to have wheelchair accessible voting booths, to have entrances and doorways that are at least 32 inches wide, to have handrails on all stairs, accessible voting equipment, to bring your service animal with you into your polling place, to seek assistance from workers at the polling place, so in terms of asking a poll worker for assistance with how to use an accessible voting machine, or to bring someone to help you vote. A person with a disability, and anybody has the right to bring someone with them to help them vote, with the exception of an employer or a union representative. So something to keep in mind as the people that you support are getting ready to participate in the election, just to make sure that we're all clear about the rights that they have, so that they don't run into any hang-ups when they try to vote. So in terms of preparing to vote, as I mentioned earlier, voter registration is pretty much over in most states. There are a handful of states where you can register to vote in person. So if you are not sure about your deadline, you can go to vote.org and you can find the voter registration deadline for your state. Similarly, with absentee ballots, a lot of those deadlines are passed or will pass very soon. I think a lot of them are around November 1st, a week before the election, so another thing to check on there. Getting to the finding your polling place, vote411.org is a great resource for this. You can also reach out directly to your state board of elections and just pop in your address and it'll identify the polling place where you're supposed to vote. There's also a tool for any deaf or hard of hearing folks. There's an SMS tool provided by the Voting Information Project. And this is a way to get all of the relevant voting information by text message, so in a more accessible format. It's also important to be aware of the voter ID laws while you're preparing to vote. I know, I'm sure all of you have seen this in the news and laws being enacted and then overturned, and it can be a little confusing about what the requirements are for your state. There's an organization called Vote Riders that has put together wallet-sized voter ID info cards available in both English and Spanish for every state. They also operate a voter ID hotline, so for any questions that come up about your ID requirements, another good resource to make sure you're prepared in advance of going to vote. On getting to the polls. So this is one of the main issues, I think, that contributed to 30% of people with disabilities having trouble being able to cast their ballots in 2012. Basic access issues into the polling place, as well as having accessible transportation to even get there in the first place. There's a new organization called Carpool Votes that connects volunteer drivers to anybody who needs a ride. And I've spoken with them, and I know that they've spoken with a number of other advocates in the disability community to make sure that their platform is fully accessible and that they're reaching out to engage drivers who have accessible vehicles and connecting those drivers to voters who need accessible transportation. So another resource for any of the folks that you support, if they need to figure out how they're getting to their polling place, this could be helpful to them. On voting and guardianship. So there may be some questions on whether a person with a disability who has a court-appointed guardian is eligible to vote. Generally speaking, a person cannot be barred from voting because of incompetence, except in limited circumstances. And it really depends on the specific state that the individual lives in, as well as the terms of their guardianship agreement. Typically, it's an individual will retain the right to vote unless it is specifically taken away by a court order. One of the things to check, I know we're getting into down to the wire with less than 2 weeks to go until Election Day, but if someone that you support has a guardian and wants to make sure that they're still able to vote, you can amend or change the guardianship agreement to make sure that it specifically leaves the individual with the right to vote. Contact a lawyer to find out about laws in your state. The State Protection and Advocacy Agency will be a great resource there. They'll have lawyers on staff that can help. Thinking about other options. Instead of having a state-appointed guardian, so a conservator or a power of attorney, long-term trying to change the laws that impact determining whether a person can vote or not. A couple of resources specifically in this area. Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered is an organization led by and for people with disabilities. They have a Vote Project Toolkit and training videos. They have a whole guide and training on registering to vote, voter rights and responsibilities, how to learn about candidates and the issues, different ways that people vote, and more. They also have a series of training videos, a few that I've listed below, and it's scenarios where a person with a disability will go into a polling place and play out some of these various scenarios. So great resource to watch with the folks that you support if you're worried about any of these issues. So onto the Rev Up Presidential Candidate Questionnaire. We asked a pretty comprehensive set of questions across the issue areas that I read earlier. These are just a handful of sample questions that we asked. We put together a comparison of how Clinton and Trump each responded to the surveys, basically putting their responses side by side so that it's easier to compare. We also, to accommodate people with various types of disabilities, we posted the full unedited answers from each candidate along with a main points section, which is a series of bullet points under each response. And these bullet points are nonpartisan and objective and meant to be a more accessible way for voters to understand exactly the points that the candidates were trying to make. So hopefully we made it a little bit easier to digest. You can find the answers to this questionnaire and the comparison at aapd.com/revup. I also put together a resource guide that I sent to the folks at ANCOR that can send around, and that has links to the questionnaire as well as some of the other resources that I mentioned. A few other resources to keep in mind. There's a ton listed at aapd.com/revup. These are just a handful of examples. The Election Assistance Commission has put together a guide of 10 tips for voters with disabilities. AAPD collaborated with Easter Seals to put together, to put together a voter checklist. The Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law also has a guide to the voting rights of people with mental health disabilities. And there's Sign Vote, which is a specifically deaf and hard of hearing GOTV mobilization effort. Finally, I want to leave you all with a few resources to use in case you or the people that you support run into any problems on Election Day. The first three numbers are all operated by the folks at Election Protection. Excuse me. First three numbers are operated by the folks at Election Protection and are a hotline that you can call day of if you run into any issues. There are also numbers for the Election Assistance Commission, the Department of Justice. You can also directly contact your state or local election office, as well as your state protection and advocacy agency. So thank you all for giving me the chance to speak with you today, and I'm happy to stay on later for any questions.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was terrific information. So let's conclude our presentation today with Abe Roffey from the ARC, and then we can move into Q&A. Abe, take it away.
Okay, so first, if you are at a browser right now, feel free to check out this URL, vote.thearc.org, and that will give you a hands-on experience of the application I'm about to share with you as I share my browser now. As I think may have been raised on the call already, 3 million people with disabilities aren't voting at the same rates of people without disabilities. So if you look at who actually shows up to the poll, our population is showing up 3 million people less And if you look at the Government Accountability Office's report on accessibility barriers at the polling places, you'll see that they've said that 73% of polling places have barriers to accessibility. So the ARC thought, what could we do to change that 73% and that 3 million number in a positive direction? So we partner with Election Protection to create the Voter Support Service. And this is also I'm showing you a website version of it. It's also an app you can get on Android, and soon, in the next few days, it'll be out on Apple. And it has just a few simple functions. One, you can find your polling place, and here it asks you to enter your address, and then it shows you your nearest polling place. Or you can ask for help. And this is connected to Election Protection's infrastructure of thousands of volunteers answering phone calls. You can call this number. Or you can enter your problem directly, which is great for people who are nonverbal or just prefer communicating through text and email. And you can enter your name, the problem, the polling place, if it's related to a polling place, and the address of that place. And then what disability-related problem or accessibility barrier are you facing? Any other information you'd like to share, and your contact info. And by the way, we're going to be aggregating this data and hopefully find some interesting patterns and insights, and maybe places to intervene based on the data. Beyond that, you can also donate, or you can join the movement, which is to sign up for our email list. This would not be possible without sponsorship from the Ruderman Family Foundation and AAPD. You can find out more at vote.thearc.org. And that's all for now. Over to you, Esme.
Great. Thank you so much. I've heard a lot about this, but I actually haven't seen it yet, Abe, so I'm excited that you're able to show it today, and we'll be checking it out. I'll be getting it on my iPhone as soon as it comes out. So let's move on to questions. For those of you that have questions, if you want to go ahead and type your question into that little chat box in the lower left of your screen, go ahead and do so. I know a couple of questions already popped up. One was a question about the availability of the PowerPoint. You will be getting this PowerPoint so you can have all those great slides. It will be sent to everyone that was registered to this webinar. And then also a question about those saved videos. We'll be sending those as well, so you have access to those resources and can share them widely. As we wait for some additional questions to come up, I think, I just wanted to pose a couple to our folks that presented today. So Jennifer and Zach, starting with you, both of you all had a lot of presence out there. I know RespectAbility was out in Iowa quite a bit. Rev Up was at both conventions, the Democratic and Republican convention. Starting with Jennifer, I'm just curious, what was the reception like for you out there? Was it hard to sort of make your voice heard? Did you have to work really hard to bring up disability issues?
Actually, there was a lot of interest by the candidates. The candidates felt that they, in many cases, had a family member or a loved one with a disability, and they felt that very few people had ever asked them about disability questions, and that they were very happy to be asked. Now, having said that, very few of them had a well-thought-out strategy or series of proposals, because they said that people had just frankly not asked them these questions before. The disability community has been far too quiet and too, not ready to ask enough, demand enough of the candidates yet, so they didn't have, real platforms. The other thing is that we did do focus groups of people with disabilities who were caucus goers in Iowa, for example, and in those caucuses, what we saw from the rank and file people with disabilities themselves, and by and large these were adults who were living on disability benefits, is that they were trying to decide between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So they were not Democrats or Republicans. They wanted to stick it to Washington because they are very angry with how things are going in this country. They felt very strongly that Washington isn't listening to them, doesn't care about them. They felt that it was true in both parties, and so there was a very ripe atmosphere for voters with disabilities to support these protest candidates. And actually that is still the case. out in America. We're about to release some poll numbers on these issues. There is a lot of anger in the disability community towards Washington at this moment in time.
What about you, Zach, for the events that you guys held at the Rev Up for the Rev Up campaign at the convention? What was the reception like there? Were you getting folks involved that were not necessarily involved in the disability movement? What was that experience like?
Sure, yeah. So we hosted those events in collaboration with the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. And actually, we only ended up hosting an event at the Democratic National Convention due to having a lack of interest of attendees RSVPing to the event that was planned to be held at the Republican National Convention. And part of that may be just from where the cities where the conventions were held and the local disability community that was able to be mobilized. But certainly for the event held at the Democratic National Convention, I think we were able to move beyond just the disability community and engage some of the folks who were in town for the broader convention. But speaking more generally on engagement and candidates being receptive to disability issues, I have to give a lot of credit to the grassroots disability community who was really active on social media or going to rallies and just trying to make their voices heard, using hashtag RevUp, using hashtag CryptoVote. There are a few others. I think we just had a lot of people from the grassroots community on the ground who tried to have an impact, and it ultimately did when we had both candidates for each of the major parties respond to our questionnaire.
Thanks to you both for that. I will say that as someone who always has some sort of news media in front of me, either print or TV or something, so I'm just up to current events, I was really impressed, and maybe this wasn't always clear to folks, but I was seeing folks from the disability movement represented at both conventions, in the audience. When they flashed to the audience, it was just a big, stark difference from previous elections. So really interesting. And of course, we see in some of the more local races, well, even at the Senate level, we have, in Illinois, a Senate race with two individuals with disabilities who are running against each other. So there's a real change, I think, that's coming about. We do have a question from Ben Conover. Let me put this out, and this is for any of you. So, given the nonpartisan statements about many of the agencies, what efforts are being made to include parties and their candidates outside of the two major party systems? So, did any of you reach out to folks outside of Republican and Democratic parties, and what kind of interest was there?
Sure. This is Jennifer Misrani. Sorry, go ahead, Zach.
Sorry, thanks, Jennifer. We did reach out to the two other main third-party candidates, Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, as well as a guy named Darrell Castle, who I'm honestly not as familiar with, but has been on more than 20 state ballots. They haven't responded to our questionnaire yet, but as soon as they do, if they do, we will absolutely promote that. I've talked to a representative from the Neurodiverse Coalition that works out of the Johnson and Veld campaign. They have our questionnaire and have indicated that they would complete it, but have not done so yet. Similarly, I've talked to some folks on the Stein campaign. I think one of their Texas state coordinators has the questionnaire and said that it would be completed. I'm still waiting to actually get the complete questionnaire. But the Stein campaign did engage with the folks running out of the Rev Up Texas campaign, and they had a little candidate forum with Dr. Stein where she was able to speak with a small group of people with disabilities and answer some of their questions. So we are very open to working with all parties running for office, and just to date have only received responses from the Democrats and the Republicans.
So this is Jennifer. We have the same phenomena, except for that in the down ballot races, interestingly, we did get some answers, for example, from the Green Party. And so when you look at the state-by-state voter guides, you do see some participation by third-party candidates.
Great. So folks, you can continue to add questions in on that side chat box. I have a question for you, Abe, in the meantime on technology. So ANCOR sent out messages to targeted states when registration dates for voting were coming up, or deadlines, I should say. And as you mentioned, a lot of the deadlines have come and gone. But I think it's still really important, even after this election, that we're making sure that people are registered to vote and that we're getting out to vote. What do you recommend technology-wise for us to be able to do this? Will it be the app that you talked about? Will there be some availability there to use that app to register people to vote? Or how do you suggest we use technology in future years to get people to register?
That's a great question. That came up when we were thinking about what problem to attack to help with voting this year. Registration, a bunch of other things came up too, rides to the polls. Maybe we could come up with something with Uber or some way that people could crowdfund rides to polls or things like that. We decided to go with real-time support so that when people are at the polling place facing a bad attitude or facing some physical barrier or facing some poorly trained poll worker, they can get real-time help then. We didn't look at registration very deeply, so I wish I had some silver bullet answers for you there, but I think that's definitely something that we should explore further.
Great. I think I'm giving you your next project, Dave. Other questions that folks have? So what do you think for our presenters, the key thing, if you could say one thing that providers should do in order to make sure that people have access to their right to vote, what would you really impress from your presentation, but also from just your experience? That if there's one thing that providers take away from this, what would you want it to be? Jennifer and Zach and Abe?
From my perspective, I think the most important thing is for them to understand where the candidates stand on the issues, because just going to vote if you don't know what the differences are is not so helpful as understanding that there are differences, what those differences are, and since there are these candidate questionnaires and candidates from both political parties took the time to answer them, it's very important for people to understand the perspectives of the candidates that are choosing to lead us in the future.
This is Zach. That's absolutely a great point. I would add that the providers can just ask questions to the people that you support. Ask if they are planning to vote. Ask if they're registered to vote, if they know where their polling place is, when they plan to vote, if they know how they're going to get to the polling place. All of questions like this help voters form a plan in their mind of how they're actually going to go and cast their vote. And studies have shown that it's more effective in having people actually go out and cast a vote if they've been thinking about some of these questions and making a plan. So certainly, and add to that, are you educated about the candidates and reference the questionnaires that Jennifer mentioned? Yeah, I would say helping the folks that you support visualize and make a plan to go out and vote.
This is Abe. Totally agree with Jennifer and Zach. And after you're educated and after you've asked those questions and you're at the polling place, if you face a barrier, don't get discouraged. Don't feel unempowered. There are folks there that can help you, and there's a service that can help you. Take your voter support service app with you or have it ready on your phone and just pass the phone to the voter, the person working at the polling station, or get instructions from the person on the phone on how to advocate for yourself or escalate the issue all the way up to the Secretary of State in the state, and then field workers can even come and help solve the situation for you.
Thank you. So using Zach's slogan of Rev Up, I want to rev up some interest in the questionnaires. I want to say for folks on the line that the campaigns receive numerous questionnaires, and they don't answer all of them. So in order, when you do receive a response from a campaign, And you can imagine that these go through a lot of vetting in the campaigns. They take a lot of work to respond to. So when there is a response, it's a pretty big deal that you've gotten a response. So big kudos to RespectAbility, AAPD, and Nickel for receiving responses from major candidates. But I wanted to get some interest in folks looking at those, and I wondered if Jennifer and Zach, if you could just maybe spotlight one issue or something that just really caught your eye in some of these responses. Again, I know that this is nonpartisan, so it's not about saying you liked one answer or another, but just something that you found really interesting in terms of responses that you received.
Actually, it is not legal to answer that question, Esme. 501c3s have to be very, very careful to give out verbatim what candidates say. We are obligated as 501c3s to give the campaigns identical questions, to give the verbatim answers out without any editorializing on it at all. And so I'm going to decline that very generous opportunity under the guidance of my attorney, who wants to keep us with the ability to have a 501c3 status.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think that's really important. So let me rephrase it and say instead, if you could spotlight some of the questions that you asked. So rather than responses, let me clarify the questions that you asked. What sort of things did you focus on in terms of what you were posing to the candidate?
So this is Zach. I can start with a few examples. I had them on the screen earlier, but just to read a couple of the questions that we asked. How would you build an infrastructure to address the underemployment and wage gaps experienced by people with disabilities? What would you do to expand access to affordable and accessible transportation for people with disabilities, especially in rural areas? As president, what would you do to address the need for affordable, integrated, accessible housing for people with disabilities? One more example, how would you work to expand access to affordable, comprehensive health care coverage for people with disabilities? And again, I would just encourage people to go to aapd.com/revup to see the questionnaire responses from Clinton and Trump, as well as to the RespectAbility report to see the answers to that questionnaire.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I hope that really provoked some interest in checking out some of the answers. Jennifer?
I'd say the identical type of questions. I particularly am interested in the issue of sexual assault of people with disabilities, which is incredibly pervasive in the ID community, incredibly pervasive, the rape and sexual assault of individuals with ID. And so I think it's very important to look at that question in particular. And interestingly, it turns out, according to the poll we're about to release, that is an incredibly important issue to voters as well.
I hope everyone on the presentation today is now looking into these questionnaires and looking at the responses, because those are important topics, and I was extremely curious to see what the responses are, and you'll see some of the candidates gave very extensive responses. So please do check out both RespectAbility and the RevUp questionnaires. We have another question that's come through from Linda McDaniel Hale. She asks, do any states have picture ballots for those individuals that cannot read? I'm not aware of it. What about you all? Nobody?
This is Zach. I'm not sure. That's something that I'd have to look into.
I do not know either.
Great. Well, we'll do some extra digging. I haven't become aware of that, but I think, as Zach mentioned, the P&As are very invested in the voting rights issues. National Disability Rights Network, which is their national organization, actually has a voting rights program, and so I suspect that they might have that information. So we will check and definitely get back to you.
There are also other formats such as an audio ballot that you can access. So I would, yeah, to your point, I would encourage you to check out your local Center for Independent Living or your state protection and advocacy agency, and they may be able to speak to your state more specifically.
Hey, Zach, this is Marie. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're cutting in and out. Do you mind repeating that again? I heard you mention that there's some audio ballots, but I've lost the rest of it, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Sure, yeah, and I'm sorry that I can't speak specifically to the photo ballots, but I do know there are other accessible formats to vote, such as an audio ballot that you can listen to and be able to cast your vote. And again, I would just recommend folks to contact their local Board of Elections or your local Center for Independent Living or your state protection and advocacy agency, and they can provide you with more information that is specific to the state you're voting in.
Great. And I would say for both of my siblings who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, they vote both at the polls, but also sometimes do absentee. And something that has proved to be very helpful is the voting guide that is often issued, I think, by the League of Women Voters typically, that goes over the issues. And so it allows us time to talk about those issues. And even those, those guides are really helpful, but for all of us, I think that sometimes they can still be confusing, but it gives you some extra time to learn about the issue, discuss it amongst yourselves. And I find that just very, very helpful. So another resource to use in advance. And I believe for somebody that wants to go to the polls and would want symbols, I believe, Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, you can have an individual with you to assist you. And they can actually maybe pre-prepare some of those symbols.
Yeah, you can. You are allowed to take someone with you to assist you voting, as long as that individual is not any way influencing the vote that the voter decides to cast. But you also cannot take a union representative or your employer as that person who helps you vote.
Great. Let's see if there's any other questions. All right, seeing none, I believe we can wrap up. I do have, since I mentioned the absentee ballot, though, I have one more question I want to ask of you all to see what kind of information you can provide. So I think that there tends to be a thought that if you use an absentee ballot, and that's something that a lot of people with disabilities use, oftentimes, they don't know necessarily if they'll have the transportation that, that was mentioned by Abe, or they don't know if they'll have a health crisis. And so planning absentee ballot, if you're not planning on doing early voting or going to the polls, is sometimes the option. But folks sometimes feel like that vote doesn't count as much. So can we clarify that a little bit on this call, how absentee ballots play out? Any thoughts from our speakers?
Sure. Well, a vote utilizing an absentee ballot absolutely does count. It's votes aren't weighed any more or less depending on how they're cast. They're all still counted.
Great. So
personally,
you
I'm
heard
a fan of absentee ballots. I think that absentee ballots are a far better way to go for individuals with disabilities, because you can do it relaxed at your own time without the rush, and you can do it any day that you want as opposed to on a Tuesday at a certain time. I find that it's a lot more relaxing to do early voting, whether it's vote by mail or in person.
Yeah, I want to just build off of Jennifer brought up a great point about early voting, and it's actually started now in, I think, around 37 states or so in the District of Columbia. So really want to underscore what Jennifer mentioned. If you are in a state that does allow early voting, definitely something that you can take advantage of in the next 2 weeks. Go vote on more of your own schedule, not worry about having large crowds of people around you. So just another thing to keep in mind. And thanks, Jennifer, for bringing that up.
Terrific. Well, I think you all shared some terrific resources with us. We're really thankful that you all were able to join us. Very thankful for the work you're doing on the ground. I know you just gave us a snippet today, but really you all do such great work on the ground and activating the grassroots. And I hope that folks do visit your website and check out more about what you're doing. But we really look at you as three of the national leaders on this. So we really appreciate your leadership. So with that, I will say thank you to all of our presenters, and I will pass it back to Marie to close us up with any final thoughts.
Thanks, Esme, and thank you, Jennifer, Zach, and Abe, and everybody for joining us this afternoon. Just to reiterate, we are going to share the audio recording, the slides, and also the resource sheet that Zach referenced during his presentation. We'll send all of those materials out to everybody so you can take a look at all of the different resources at your leisure after this webinar. So thanks again, everybody, and with that, we can go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.